he is espousing a kind of radical nationalism tinged with violence and a cult of violence that, really overlays, what we saw in Italy in the 20s and Germany in the 30s pretty well. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, a non-resident fellow at the University of Virginia and a counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments and a Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined by my colleague in all things strategery, Eliot Cohen, who is the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic International Studies and Professor Emeritus of Strategy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Eliot, how are you on this fine fall day?
Grouchy. It's a nice day.
That's so unlike you.
Yeah, well, it's kind of, I like it. It's cold. It could be colder. It could be a little bit darker and rainier. I'd prefer that. But there's enough of that, the beginning of the autumnal bite. So over the weekend, my wife and I went to see this play called This Piece of Ground, which is one of these 2-hour soliloquies by a historical figure. Nominally, it's about Eisenhower. And I thought it might be okay. And boy, was I wrong. And so I'm going to say what I was saying to my wife on the way back, although she did periodically interrupt by saying, "Dear, you're ranting again." But the thing that really struck me, first, the actor kind of played Eisenhower as George C. Scott played Patton, which was a bit jarring, although Eisenhower had a temper. But it was this reinterpretation of Eisenhower to make him palatable to American progressives. So he comes out as he's a pacifist. He's against nuclear weapons, which is a little bit surprising for those of us who know anything about the nuclear policy of the Eisenhower administration. And he's somebody who never wanted to be president. And so becoming president was just something he stumbled into. And although there were issues with the Russians, there weren't really issues with, communism. And I, in addition to just being irritated at the and they threw in America first in the 50s instead of the 40s, and they kind of Trumpified Robert Taft, which is not really fair. But the thing that really struck me about it, to be momentarily serious, is that, I was thinking that this is the kind of preachiness about the past that really sets a lot of people off and does help explain some of the antipathy to the cultural left, which I think, animates some part of Trump. I'm sure, like you, I've got a lot of Democratic friends who are in the state of developing hysteria about the election. And for good reason. But the thing that they really find it hard to wrestle with is, well, why are so many people likely to vote on the other side?
Right.
And, you can come up with lots of evil explanations, and some of those are right. There are very dark things at work there. And for sure, Donald Trump is not appealing to the better angels of our nature. But there are other things which people are reacting against. And I just fear that people haven't taken that seriously. So
it's famously Pauline Kael in 1972 said she, couldn't understand how Richard Nixon was, going to be elected overwhelmingly because she didn't, living in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, she didn't know anybody who was going to vote for Nixon. How could he be winning by so much?
I hate to say this, Eric. You need to explain who Pauline Kael is, because I guarantee you that 90% of our listeners have never heard of her.
Pauline Kael was the movie critic of The New Yorker at the time.
Very famous at the time.
The whole Eisenhower thing is interesting. Our friend Derek Chollet, just before he went back into government at the beginning of the Biden administration, published a book which was, a little noted at the time and probably, not to be remembered very much, I'm afraid, which I reviewed for Orbis, actually. And in it, he was trying to sort of revise and extend the case for Obama that he made in his book, The Long Game, about Obama, which argued, as you know, before Obama finished his term, that Obama was this incredibly consequential foreign policy president, completely changed the way people in Washington thought about foreign affairs, which I think both you and I at the time thought was, not correct. So in this book, Derek attempts to kind of create a kind of moderate tradition, a moderate pragmatic tradition to which Obama belonged, that was the way of which was paved by moderate Republicans, notably George H.W. Bush and Dwight Eisenhower. And the book was called The Middle Way. And of course, that appeals in some sense to Eisenhower, who spoke about the middle way after he won the 1952 presidential nomination. But I think it rests, I was not terribly kind to Derek's book. I said sort of, liberal Democrats, really love dead Republican presidents. They just don't like them at the time. But the truth was that, the middle way really was a reaction to Robert Taft. And look, Trump is in many ways the legatee of Taft. It's unfair to Taft only in the sense that Taft was a serious intellect,
Yes.
and a man of conviction, which Trump is not, albeit those convictions, I think, were seriously misguided. Although if one reads his foreign policy book, written at the time of the NATO treaty, Foreign Policy for Americans, it is not nearly as wacky and crazy as the version espoused by Trump at all. But to go back to Eisenhower, at the time, Democrats reviled Eisenhower. In fact, they denied that he was actually actively leading the country as president. He was a figurehead. He was being manipulated by John Foster Dulles. And we now know in retrospect, with the historiography that's emerged since then, he was very much in charge. And Dulles, definitely was not running the show. I think there was a tendency in sort of Eisenhower revisionism to paint him, in light of the way he was portrayed at the time by the commentariat, by liberal Democrats in particular, as a not very bright bulb, who then was succeeded by a president who got us into, the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam and all sorts of other things. There's been a tendency to sort of portray Eisenhower in a more favorable light than he deserves. I mean, he was way better than the caricature in the 1950s, for sure, but also, serious limitations on a variety of different issues, notably including one of the things that historians have praised him for most, which was Suez, which he came to actually regard as his biggest mistake as president. So yeah. I think there's a lot of mythologizing about Eisenhower, and I'm not surprised that it's showed up on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, well, the one thing I'll say, the conceit of the play is Eisenhower in retirement, and he look at the newspaper, and there's a poll of historians led by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and they're doing these stupid lists of presidents, and he ranks 22 out of 31 or 32, whatever it is. And, and he's steamed about it. Of course, those lists are always, and then, at the end of the play, it shows, no, he's actually kind of gone way up. Well, those lists are really stupid. They now have Obama like at number 7. And it's just very hard, I think, to sustain the idea that Obama was anything like a great president. But, there's another angle to it as well, which is, the way we portray, it goes to the way we portray history, which is a topic I'd like us to go into. First, Eisenhower was a complicated man. So,
right.
Look, he did have some sort of affair with his driver during World War II.
Kay Summersby.
That's a long, complicated story. On civil rights, yes, he sent the 101st into Little Rock, but that wasn't because he was a crusader for civil rights. It had a lot to do with his attorney general who was pressing him on it, and has a lot to do with his sense of law and order.
But he also thought that appointing Earl Warren was one of the bigger mistakes he made in the White House.
Right. And he, the other thing is the sort of the idea that he never wanted to be president, just ludicrous. I mean, and on the other hand, this is why actually I find it hard, to conceive why people would have thought that he's simply a dim bulb. For somebody to be the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II and manage that coalition, particularly to manage the British, which he did brilliantly. He was not a brilliant field commander. He really had actually almost no field experience before he ends up leading the invasion of North Africa. And even then, the Brits have the number twos are all British officers. You couldn't do that unless you had tremendous political sense. He was able to handle Churchill. He was able to handle Montgomery. Clearly
a great coalition manager.
Right. And it does remind me of the way in which people kind of patronized Reagan, who obviously had a great political talent. And as you and I were discussing before, I think one of the things I now find myself brooding a bit about is that the way in which the people who write the histories and the biographies, and certainly the commentariat afterwards, because they are such different kinds of people than the people they are writing about, find it really hard to crawl inside their skin.
Yeah.
There's some people who can do it, but it's actually really, really difficult to do. Maybe a great novelist can do it. I don't know.
Well, our colleague and friend Mel Leer, who we've had on the show, actually excels at that to the point that other historians have, found him, suspect because he, wrote about Herbert Hoover and actually found something, positive to say about Hoover. He wrote about Harry Truman and found very positive things to say about Truman, positive things to say about Reagan, and even, George W. Bush. So,
well, that's the ultimate sin.
Yeah, of course. I think that is true. I do want to get on to talk about the revelations recently by Bob Woodward, but I think there's a connection to what we're talking about, which is if you look at the commentary during the Eisenhower era and beyond into the 60s, when you had people like Scotty Reston and Walter Lippmann, who's given the title to this podcast, from his work, these were serious, figures. Yeah. Even Joe Kraft, the Alsop brothers. These were, you can criticize them. There's plenty to be critical about, but they were serious figures with a sense of history. Some of them, like Lippmann, had participated in government at senior levels, had a sense of how these things worked. And it just, you had that on one level, and you also had, it took a while for people wrote their memoirs after they left office, and usually after the administration in which they served had completed its term, as opposed to in media res, which we see all the time now. And you didn't, I'm not naive. There was plenty of leaking to favored, correspondence and whatnot, but you did not have the phenomenon you have now of people writing kind of TikToks of everything that goes on in an administration in real time.
Yeah. One thing that's inconceivable now is that, before D-Day, Eisenhower's talking to senior members of the press.
Right.
And they're holding the secrets. So speaking of that, maybe let's transition. You mentioned the Bob Woodward book, which is just coming out. This is, I don't know, like the 20th of, his.
Which you and I should stipulate neither of us has read.
Neither of us has read the book, and neither of us has talked to Woodward. At least I haven't, Eric.
I have not talked to him in at least 2 years, and that was at a social event.
Okay, so you say.
And I never spoke to him when I was in government, ever.
Well, and as a matter of fact, I always felt, I'm going to talk about an ethical breach, not by Woodward, because he's doing his job. It was so clear in the books about the George W. Bush administration that that Colin Powell was talking to him all the time. And I always thought that was wrong. That was really, really wrong.
And I think the other person who was talking to him during the George W. Bush administration was Larry Wilkerson, who was, Colin Powell's military assistant, who never was in any of the meetings that are discussed in the Woodward books. Yeah. And I actually attended not all, but many of those meetings. And I think what Larry Wilkerson represented in his...
He was his chief of staff.
He was Colin's chief of staff.
Yeah.
And he represented, I think, what the French call, you and I've had this conversation, l'esprit de l'escalier, the thing you wish you had said at the meeting when you get back to your office, and you unload on your chief of staff. And I think that's a lot of what, Woodward, got. But having said that, although for most of my career, I was too junior to be of interest to Woodward, so I never spoke to him. But I did when I was, George Shultz's special assistant, when he came in and interviewed George Shultz and other senior officials. I mean, it was amazing, his access to people and his ability to ferret information out. And I don't doubt that he is accurately, retelling what people told him. It's just that, of course, everybody who talks to him is an interested actor, and therefore one has to be a little bit careful about how one takes all of this.
Well, and I mean, you can tell me whether I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, Cheney did not speak to him. And
I don't believe so.
And surprise, surprise, Cheney doesn't come out all that well in those books.
Right.
I do think, of course, what Woodward now has is he's the beneficiary of his reputation, because everybody knows he's going to write a blockbuster. Everybody knows it's going to be all over the place. Everybody thinks everybody else is going to be talking to him, so I better talk to him in order.
Sure.
And I have met him like once or twice, and again on sort of social occasions. And each time, I'm struck by a sort of an ingratiating manner, and he uses that, and I don't blame him for it. That's, like I said, that's his job. Okay, so that said, bottom line, anything in the outtakes in the Washington Post and New York Times that caught your attention?
Well, let's start with the one that I want to talk about the ones that have gotten a lot of coverage and which are Trump's providing Putin with an Abbott COVID test machine in a period when Americans could not get tested, which has now been confirmed by the Kremlin, by Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesperson. The question of whether or not he has spoken since he left office to Putin on multiple occasions, that I think we should get into that, and also what Mark Milley is reputed to have said to Woodward. But what has not gotten as much coverage, which I think deserves some coverage, is apparently Joe Biden's anger at the Obama administration in which he served, for having not gotten things right with Putin, and therefore having, in some sense, left the Putin problem for him to have to manage on his watch when he had other things he wanted to do. That seems to me to be very, very newsworthy, but not gotten as much attention as it should. Now, in all fairness, Joe Biden during the Obama administration, according to various accounts, was much more forward-leaning about arming Ukraine with lethal assistance than his president was, and so he may come by his high dudgeon, honestly.
Well, I guess I think about that two ways. First, I think Biden is prone to high dudgeon. He's as he himself would probably say, he does have an Irish temper. Probably not allowed to say that, but I think he would say that about himself. I think that's one side of it, and that's why the other, the torrent of expletives about Bibi Netanyahu, I completely get that. But I think the other thing is I've always thought throughout this administration that one way to understand what Biden is doing is he's still kind of showing Barack Obama how it's really supposed to be done if you're a real pro who's been in Washington for a long time, as opposed to some kid from Chicago who hasn't had any real life experience, as opposed to somebody who's been in the Senate for 50 years and so forth. And I think, that I suspect that when we actually find out more, for example, about the decision to withdraw so precipitately from Afghanistan, that an element of that is saying, screw you, Barack, I'm going to show you how the job is really done. Now, I mean, that I think was a real low point. I think a high point, I think on Ukraine, and even to an even greater degree with Israel, because he is somebody who is a warm politician as opposed to Obama, who's a cool politician. Like with Israel, I understand that it was a good thing for him to go there right after October 7th. And, even hard-bitten, very hard-bitten Israeli friends of mine in their security establishment say, that you have no idea how much that meant to us. I think in a similar way, his decision to actually go to Kyiv, which people have tended to forget about, that's a very big deal. And I think Obama just wouldn't have been able to do those kinds of, very sort of retail politician things. So there is actually something to what he says. But that didn't surprise me. I suppose I wasn't particularly surprised either by the Mark Milley quote. I mean, by the way, I don't think Milley is exactly right. I don't think Trump is a fascist. The fascists were organized and had an organizing ideology. And, it says something about the poverty of our language that you can't say, evil, rotten scoundrel unless you call somebody a fascist. And that's not quite the right word, I don't think. Or am I being too picky?
I don't know. I mean, I think he checks a lot. I think he checks a lot of the boxes. The fact that he's about to have a rally at the end of October in Madison Square Garden, that sort of is almost a doppelganger of the Nazi rally there in 1938. I mean, if the shoe fits, I think you can. Well, look, he is espousing a kind of radical nationalism tinged with violence and a cult of violence that really overlays what we saw in Italy in the 20s and Germany in the 30s pretty well.
Yeah, except the way I would qualify that, all those things are true. I mean, I think that makes him sort of like a violent dictatorial type. There's what fascism had. Fascism was a revolutionary ideology. We tend to forget. And right. Nazism even more so. It was revolutionary. It had a different concept for the ordering of society. And it had an image of a society that is disciplined to march in a certain direction, that is kind of militarized. And although, there's some tinges of that in Trump, I don't think they're going to go that far. Don't get me wrong. I believe he's a very dangerous man. I think he would like to be a dictator for sure. He doesn't have any understanding of the Constitution, rule of law, none of that, I think, lands on him. But I, particularly given that we are entering a period which has some echoes of the 1930s, I think it's a mistake to resort too easily to that word. That's I may be straining at gnats here. I mean, of course, the important fact is that Milley thinks, who we both know, and he has his weaknesses as well as his strengths. But what he's basically telling the American people is this is a very dangerous guy who will know no limits. And in that respect, I think he's completely right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, what about the business of the 7 alleged phone calls? I mean, I think we have to be really careful here because this is a sole source, hasn't been confirmed by anybody else. I know Peter Baker, in the New York Times, other journalists have been talking to people in the Trump orbit. Nobody else can confirm it. I don't think that means it didn't happen, because you could also imagine that he would keep that pretty quiet, but what do you make of that?
I actually don't make a whole lot of it in the same way I didn't get too exercised about the COVID tests. That's actually something I would sort of expect a president who wants to curry some favor to do. I mean, it's also, if he was not thinking this way, I'm quite sure. But if you wanted to say, we are the scientific as well as the military superpower, you'd say, here, how would you like a reliable COVID test? So I don't think he thought that way, but that part didn't bother me. The problem with Trump, as always, I think, is we've known what he is all along. And I don't think that there's any way in which we're going to learn anything that'll make us feel that he's any more rotten than we already know he is.
Fair enough. One thing that strikes me about the sort of Woodward oeuvre, if you will, is it's very strong on kind of narrative.
Yeah.
And lots of discussion of, who hit John and who said what about John, in every administration, but not terribly analytic about why things are happening or what the larger issues are. And I know you've been doing some work recently that focuses on, people who, did commentary during the World War II period, but who were much more, serious as historians and whatnot. What do you think about all that?
So thank you for giving me another opportunity to rant. No, look, I think Woodward is a stenographer. He's taking dictation. He double checks it so that, I tend to believe the quotes, although the thing which is very fishy, and I think any historian cringes at, is when these verbatim quotes of what somebody said in a meeting where there was no audio recorder. That's problematic. I mean, nobody remembers their exact words. I don't remember my exact words at breakfast this morning. For sure, people don't remember their exact words in the sit room a year or two later, and it is misleading and it's not true.
And even more, there are occasions in some of his books where he describes what somebody was thinking to themselves.
Right. So that's really problematic.
Which, unless he has it directly from the person, even then it's, as you say, how do you validate that?
It's not even, as Don Oberdorfer once said, the first draft of history. I mean, Don Oberdorfer is another journalist of the old school who I think did do some of that. So you mentioned that I've been thinking about this in the context not of political analysis, but military analysis. So I'm writing a book about, taking my swing at writing a strategy book. I'm planning on making it short enough so that people will actually read it, which is, I cannot say about some of the other works that have come out recently, which, you're going to hurt your wrist if you try to pick them up. And one of the things it's caused me to do is, as happens when you begin writing a book, you go down various rabbit holes. And the rabbit hole that I've gone down is there are a number of writers from earlier in the 20th century who I discover really are very interesting. And one of them is somebody named Cyril Falls. So Cyril Falls was, for about 6 or 7 years, the Chichely Professor of the History of War at Oxford, which is probably the most prestigious military history chair in the English-speaking world. He was succeeded eventually by Michael Howard, eventually by Sir Hugh Strachan. These are fantastic, extraordinary historians. Falls had served in World War I with distinction. He did not have a PhD. He ended up writing first the history of his division, the 36th Ulster Division, but then several volumes of the official history. He then becomes the military correspondent of the Times of London during World War II. And after that, the titular professor. And there are a couple of things that really struck me about it. First, like I said, I suddenly got interested in the guy. So thanks to the miracles of library research, I was able to look at some of his articles from the Times during World War II. And they're tremendously insightful. They're so much better than the kind of stuff you get today. And it's not, he had good sources, but there's more than that. And then I looked at some of the books that he wrote afterwards, which are like, I've got one sitting on my desk right here, The Nature of Modern Warfare, and others. And they're great. Now, the thing that strikes me about it is that was back in the day where the worlds of serious journalism and serious academic inquiry were not that far apart. You could not get the Chichely chair without a PhD today, and you certainly don't need it to be a correspondent. And the other thing about it is that Falls was an operational historian. I mean, he did set things in a political context, but he really went out of fashion because in the beginning, I would say in the 50s and 60s, you begin to get the kind of war and society view of things where people will say, you don't want the old guns and trumpets kind of history. You want history which is really far more sociological and all that. The upshot of all that, quite apart from my, now Don Quixote-like desire to restore Cyril Falls to his proper place in the pantheon, is when I look at the military commentary that we see in the major news outlets or coming out of the academic world, either place, they're just not nearly as good. And it's a serious problem because if we're trying to follow, as people should, the Ukraine war or the Israel-Hamas or Israel-Hezbollah war, you want to have people who really are good military analysts, but who have behind their understanding of what's going on today a much, much deeper historical awareness. And we've sort of lost that.
As someone who was trained as a professional historian before he went into government, of course, I agree with you. But I think one of the things that's been lost is a sense of chronology, because we don't teach history, as narrative anymore. It's the analog of what you were saying with the, military history now being the social history of military affairs rather than, the boring stuff of, dead white guys fighting battles. And you see that in history kind of writ large, political history, diplomatic history, disfavored, social, cultural, gendered history, history of class, history of race. Those are favored, but those are usually not taught chronologically. It's really the problem of this or the problem of that in a very asynchronous way. And I had a conversation with someone recently who was recounting to me a discussion they had with a former national security advisor, very well plugged in, who was lamenting the fact that a lot of senior officials no longer know any history, and that it's a huge problem.
One of the problems also is if you don't pay attention to chronology, you're going to screw up your understanding of causation. If something happens but after something else, it cannot have caused it. And it's actually quite stunning how often people make that sort of mistake. There's a wonderful book, which one of David Hackett Fisher's early books,
Historians'
Fallacies, which I commend to all of our listeners. I mean, wonderful historian. Paul Revere's Ride, a bunch of other books. Washington's Crossing is also fabulous. But it's this catalog of mistakes that even professional historians make in regard to things like that. And if you don't have drilled into you that sense of chronology, then you've got a real problem. So I do worry about the difficulty people have just in kind of comprehending and understanding what's going on. Speaking of what's going on,
the other thing that's happened, you can see it, is the collapse of enrollment in history courses at major universities across the country.
Yes. Oh, I remember talking to a very distinguished historian at Stanford, one of the greats, who's retired for quite a while, who was tearing his hair out. He said, when I came to Stanford, it was the largest concentration here. Now it's one of the smallest in the humanities, let alone the natural or the social sciences. So absolutely. And it is unquestionably going to get us, it does get us into trouble. I mean, the idea that you can make responsible statesman-like decisions without a knowledge of history is false. So speaking of history in the making, just had a couple of big hurricanes, and there have been some interesting stories coming out of that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. I think going back a couple of weeks to a conversation you and I had with Ann Applebaum, I think what we are seeing is a concentrated effort by our adversaries to take advantage of our divisions and of natural disasters to spawn all sorts of misinformation, disinformation about both Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, in hopes of creating chaos and dividing us here at home even further. And I mean, you see this repeatedly in discussions where Republican governors, conservative Republican governors, are coming out and saying what Trump and Vance are saying about the government's relief effort, the federal government's relief efforts, is false. To the point that we now have, people being relocated because they're credible rumors that, militias, right-wing militias, are out hunting, FEMA employees. Now, some of that may be overdrawn, but in areas of the country where a lot of people are packing, weapons, it's probably, easy for people to give a lot of credibility to those kinds of rumors. And it's I think a terrible indicator of where we are as a nation.
So they're not just rumors. I was was in on some correspondence with an officer in the 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and they're doing relief work in the mountains there. And somebody else said, is there any truth to this idea that there are all these guys, militia types out there? So, oh yeah, no, there are a lot of guys on all-terrain vehicles with assault rifles, but they seem pretty friendly so far. And I agree with you. And, you read stories about people, meteorologists being threatened and, the weather being controlled. This now, okay, it's a particular part of the country, particular set of circumstances, but some of this sort of thing has been going on for a while. And again, sense of perspective. You and I are both old enough to remember when, people got really concerned about the communists putting fluoride in the water, for the purposes of maintaining people's dental health. So it's not, Richard Hofstadter was right. There's a paranoid streak in American politics. It's been around for a long time. I do think
it goes back to before the founding. Actually, it goes back to the colonial opposition to the British.
Yeah. So there is a history of this, but this is one case where I think one of the root causes is really a profound failure in public education. Now, there may be many reasons for that, but it's by the time somebody's, say, 15, so even before they graduate high school, they really should have some sort of basic skills at trying to figure out what is truth and what is falsehood, what is probable and what is improbable, knowing how to suspend judgment, all those traits. And I would like to think that there was a lot more of that in the earlier parts of the 20th century. But I just have a feeling that we've sort of lost some of that. Now, is that the fault of teachers? Is it the fault of local communities? Is it the fault of politicians? I'm not smart enough to say.
I just want to just for a moment, talk about Hofstadter. When I was in graduate school in the 1970s, Richard Hofstadter, who died, I think, in either maybe 70 or 71, 72, right around, he had just passed away at a very relatively early age, given his
he was young,
prolific output, was in some disfavor in the academy.
Really? I didn't know that.
Among American historians, in part because he was part of that group of historians who were like Daniel Borston and a few others who were described as the consensus historians, who believed that American history had been marked by great consensus, and the vogue in those days was history from the bottom up, social history, the people who, the working class whose history hadn't been told and who were not allegedly part of this broader consensus, etc. He was also in some disfavor because by and large, he didn't do a lot of work in primary sources. He was a great synthesizer, tremendous synthesizer. But I think I have come to have much, even though I don't agree with a lot of things, he wrote. He famously said that the Declaration of Independence had, all the, or maybe it was the Emancipation Proclamation that it had, all the drama of a bill of lading or something. But and he was really
the Emancipation. That's true of the Emancipation Proclamation. If you read
he
it,
was
it's a very deliberately boring document.
Right. He's very negative about Lincoln, which I think is wrong. But I have come to admire his work in many, many ways in retrospect. And one of, the paranoid style, part of what he, says about the paranoid style was it is a reaction of people to status anxiety in periods of rapid social change, that people who feel they're losing their status and find ways to explain it that are essentially, what we would today describe as conspiracy theories. And I think there's a lot to that. And I think that explains a lot of what we're, going through right now.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense to me. He is one of those historians. The 20th century was really, again, particularly I would say the first half century plus-ish. There's some magnificent historians. Somebody who is not remembered today at all, but who was quite a large figure in his time was Alan Nevins.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever read any of his massive
History of the Civil War.
It's like a 6 or 8 volume work on the crisis of the Union.
I have it sitting on my shelf here.
As do I. That's a fantastic, and he wrote an enormous amount. He also wrote a very good book on the writing of history called The Gateway to History, which again I would commend to anybody, because it really shows you how history as a discipline is a great preparation for somebody who's interested in understanding the contemporary world. The kinds of question you ask. And he was somebody who could empathize with all kinds of characters, which is what a really good historian has to do. But there were plenty of others. I don't know if I've ever warbled on about this, but one of my prized possessions is about 4 or 5 years worth of my parents' subscription to American Heritage. I don't know if you ever saw American Heritage with the hardbound.
The hardbound one, yeah.
They were beautifully produced. And
Right.
You read it and you say, my God, every great historian
wrote for them
in the United States wrote there. Every last one. And this was considered middle brow. And it was history largely, although not entirely, as narrative. It was wrestling with the question of American identity and sort of the big issues in American history. And gosh, I think at one level, the Academy has certainly lost that. And the higher realms of journalism have. I mean, there's still historians who practice it. I think I may have mentioned the last time we spoke. I've been reading Erik Larson's The Demons of Unrest, or The Demon of Unrest, about Sumter, really the crisis of the Union. Fantastic book. And by the way, speaking of craziness, I mean, it shows you just how deeply crazy South Carolina in particular was. And, that which I think is something even now with what is on the whole a more sensible view of what that war was about, i.e. slavery. People still don't fully get just how Looney Tunes a lot of the ideology of the South was. One part of which, by the way, was you were beginning to get coming out of the South supposedly serious people basically describing people of color as a different species, no longer human. I mean, it was, we were talking earlier about fascists and Nazis. It was getting to that point, and we tend to forget some of that.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, the two craziest states in the Confederacy were South Carolina and Mississippi, and I believe I'm correct in saying that they had the highest percentage of enslaved people as percentage of the population. And that tells you something about how uneasy, about the status anxiety of the white master class in those states.
And of course, just, one great irony in all this, which is part of what makes American history so fascinating. South Carolina, the basic constitution is set up by John Locke, great theorist first really major theorist of free government.
Let's turn from that to a couple of things that are going on in the world. We've got just a little bit of time left. It's been 2 weeks now since Iran attacked Israel with the largest ballistic missile barrage that one nation state has ever visited on another. Still waiting for the Israeli response. The U.S. has just sent, Secretary Lloyd Austin has just announced, Secretary of Defense has just announced dispatching a THAAD battalion with, a complement of U.S. troops to man it as part of the defense of Israel. What do you think's going on, and what do you think's likely to happen?
Well, this is, as who should say, deja vu all over again. Because actually you had something very similar happen during the first Gulf War, as you may recall, when we sent missile defenses over there. And the idea was we wanted to prevent the Israelis from retaliating against Iraq in the middle of the Iraq War.
We also sent Lawrence Eagleburger and Paul Wolfowitz together to babysit the Israeli government.
But I think and the Israelis appreciate it. There's a wonderful Yemenite restaurant in Tel Aviv that I always try to go to when I'm there, Maganda, and they've got the guy who founded it had himself been a paratrooper, a very colorful character, and the walls are covered with pictures of American soldiers from then, because what this guy did is he went out there with his barbecue and began filling all these guys up with as much shawarma and falafel as they could take as an expression of gratitude. So, but I think that the motivation's the same, which is if you hug the Israelis, then maybe you limit what they want to do. Now, the problem is, as with so much of what we're doing, there's nothing, this is tactical, it's not strategic. It's tactical in the sense that we know what we don't want them to do. We want to try to contain this, but there's really no visible sort of longer term picture. And one thing I've grown increasingly irritated by is every single president and every single presidential candidate on both sides, going back, 4 or 5 administrations, says we will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Well, by God, they are going to have nuclear weapons unless we really do something kinetic about it. And it's another example of how we can kind of just sort of cover our eyes or maybe stick our fingers in our ears and pretend that nobody can see us, or that, we can't hear any of the bad things.
And we're sleepwalking. We're sleepwalking into a Iranian nuclear capability. I think there's no question about that.
But how do you read it?
I'm pretty much the same. I mean, the administration doesn't want Iran to, doesn't want Israel to hit Iranian nuclear targets. And I can see the argument there. I mean, the argument is you don't want to prompt the Iranians to make a run to the bomb. That would be a little bit more compelling if we had an actual strategy for stopping them from getting there. The administration doesn't want, doesn't want them to hit energy, targets, oil export terminals at Karg Island or things like that, because it might raise the price of oil. Although there's questions about that, but they don't want to take a chance having oil prices spike right before the election. They don't want them to do leadership targeting. So kind of you're beginning to narrow the target set, quite a bit. I mean, the problem is, and the Iranians are plenty nervous about this. I mean, they are signaling, in all directions that they're very nervous about what the Israelis might do to them. They're reaching out to, the Arab states who they believe have better, have reasonably good relations with Israel, like UAE and, to some degree, the Saudis. But again, I agree with you. I don't think we have a strategy here. I think it's all just tactical.
Well, there is something that's one thing that was a bit overlooked. Actually, I will tip my hat to my second favorite podcast on the planet, Ukraine the Latest, which had a long report on Putin going to a conference in, I think, Turkmenistan, this very obscure conference in a pretty obscure country. But the main thing is the president of Iran was going to be there. And the two of them met and had talks.
Met with Pezeshkian, yeah.
And I one of the things I worry about is, you and I have talked a lot about this before, but the coalition of the malignant has been getting tighter and tighter. I'll confess, with this last attack where a Hezbollah drone, I guess, got through and hit an Israeli base. So the real target apparently was the Israeli chief of staff, who was supposed to be there. And that's pretty good intelligence if you knew that he was supposed to be there. And I was wondering who gave that to them. It could be Hezbollah. I kind of doubt it. Could be Iran, maybe. Well, what other country would have the intelligence capabilities to be able to say, yeah, the chief of staff of the IDF is going to be there? And, we do know that the Russians are, as to use a phrase that's been out there in places like The Economist, really trying to cause murder and mayhem in Europe. Real murder and mayhem.
Yes. I mean, the head of the German, domestic intelligence service just today talking about a Russian effort that would have brought down a DHL cargo aircraft. It would have been a catastrophic accident. The administration, I think, one of the reasons it has not really articulated a lot publicly, but which I think is lurking back there in explaining why it is unwilling to allow the Ukrainians to strike Russian targets with U.S. weapons, is that the Russians might step up that campaign. But they're already doing it. I mean, the other sign of the intensifying, access of upheaval or evil or both is the fact that apparently in one of the Ukrainian deep strikes in September that hit Russians' munitions storage arsenal, which had all sorts of secondary explosions, in part because they believe that North Korean ballistic missiles might have been stored there, and some North Korean general officers were killed, or officers. Now, I'm not sure if they were general officers, but officers were killed. And we're now seeing reports of, North Korean troops showing up in the fight, because Putin doesn't want to actually, dragoon Russians in the major urban areas in Russia proper, that is to say Moscow, St. Petersburg, other, Novgorod. He wants, to get essentially, others to fight for him. And, this is a very worrisome, development. And I think, obviously this is not a foreign policy election for sure, but it should be.
Yeah, I agree with that. And unfortunately, I'm not quite as optimistic as I once was that Kamala Harris will win. And the truth is, even if she wins, I would be lying if I didn't say I have a lot of concerns.
Yeah. Let me ask you this one final question before we go, because we're running out of time. So last week, I expressed a lot of concern about what our adversaries might do after the election to take advantage of our divisions, and particularly questions about who had actually won the election. In light of what we're seeing, with all this misinformation, disinformation about the hurricanes, you were kind of poo-pooing what I was my fear. I mean, are you getting more fearful, or are you pretty much still?
Life is still worried? All carnations and unicorns.
Okay. All right.
No, the reason why I think if it is, by margins of more than, a few hundred or maybe 1,000 votes, and Kamala Harris wins, then I think whatever happens, the fact is that the Democrats will control the levers of power. The FBI will be in responsible hands, as will justice, as will the military. And, I'll stand by what I said last week, which is I think most of the people who are potentially violent on the whole are not looking, to have happened to them what's happened to a whole bunch of the people who rioted on January 6th. Will there be efforts? Sure. Will Trump accept the outcome? No, he won't. But I do think it's reasonably clear that people are exhausted with this. Now, there are those people who, will vote for, there's some portion of people who are infatuated with Trump. Okay. That's a group. I think, the larger margin who will vote for him are, they're ticked off about the economy. They're ticked off about a bunch of other things. They're ticked off about the border. They don't feel they know Kamala Harris. They don't trust her. They really don't like Biden. But I don't think most of them want upheaval. I don't think that's what most Americans want. And at the end of the day, for me, I think that's going to be the key thing. But honestly, so long as Donald Trump is a major political figure, I think the danger of political turmoil of some kind is going to remain. So, I just hope he, in his retirement, discovers painting. I'm not quite sure what he would paint, mind you. It would probably be. Actually, the way modern art is, I'm sure he'd do brilliantly. You could make a vast amount of money, Donald, if you're listening to me.
If only from your lips to God's ear. All right, that's going to have to do it for this week's Shield of the Republic. We'll be back next week with Major General Mick Ryan back to visit us with his excellent book on the war in Ukraine, which we'll talk about.